Evening, everybody. We are going to explore topic 8.4. This should be a relatively quick little set of notes here, but we're just going to look at human impacts on wetlands. And in that time, we'll talk a little bit about what wetlands are, why they're important, and then kind of what humans have done to our wetlands over time. All right. So the reading, just a couple pages from your textbook. It's actually from a previous chapter, pages 279 through 282. That would be a great follow-up to what we discussed in this set of notes here. But first of all, let's talk about what constitutes a wetland. So, first of all, wetlands are referring to a whole class and a pretty diverse class of different little habitats, right? But in order to be called a wetland, right, um, we're looking at standing water, right, or flowing or standing water for at least part of the year. So maybe at least a month of the year, there's literally standing, kind of flowing water through. Okay, so different from like a pond or a lake, and different from a stream in a lot of ways. And those make up our wetlands. So some good examples of some local wetlands. Um, Closest one I can think of off the top of my head that most of you guys have probably seen would be on the way to Tri-Cities after you take a right turn there at the Wallula Junction and start heading north up into Pasco. Before you get to Pasco, there's McNary Wildlife Refuge in there. That's an example of a wetland. All right. Um, but they are specific and special habitats because the plants are adapted to the specific conditions of a wetland, right? And then there's this whole group of organisms that use them for habitats, right? The soils, for example, because of the standing water, they tend to be really low oxygen soils, which makes the plants that grow in them having to have specific adaptations for them. All right. But wetlands encompass, like I said, lots of different habitats. Okay. Um, so why take the time to discuss wetlands specifically? Well, it's because they're probably a lot more important than most people think, or a lot more important than is immediately apparent to us, right? They are among the most valuable types of landforms, both in terms of maintaining ecosystem services, which we'll talk about, but they also have some commercial value too, commercial value in their intact state. All right. So, for example, some of the ecosystem services they provide flood protection. So they act like a giant sponge in a lot of cases, and it can absorb a lot of water that would normally contribute to a flood. They are nature's filters, right? They are really, really effective at maintaining water quality, breaking down all kinds of harmful pollutants and trapping them in the wetlands. The microbes there can break those down into less harmful materials. And there's all kinds of economic benefits they can provide, both agriculturally and commercially. All right. Um, Despite these really, really important ecosystem services, though, they are still among the fastest disappearing types of landforms. All right. Most have been drained, filled, used as dumps, and they're just generally misunderstood. Okay. Um, they're very complicated ecosystems, but they work for all living things. Okay. And the most important thing to understand is that we need to maintain our wetlands because wetlands are really important supporters of life in general, not just for humans, for these ecosystem services mentioned there, but they're super important habitat. All right. So we have freshwater wetlands, and that's like the one up at McNary I just mentioned earlier. All right. Uh, but your freshwater wetlands include marshes, bogs, swamps, and stream banks. All right. Um, the source of water, typically from surface runoff, sometimes underground springs or flooding rivers, contribute to the formation of freshwater wetlands. Um, and one of the special adaptations plants have to have is they have to be adapted to fluctuating water conditions. So again, can they survive in standing water for months on end, but then also be able to tolerate when the wetland may or may not have standing water in it at another point in the year. All right. Our coastal wetlands are really interesting uh, because those include species that can tolerate both saltwater, and freshwater. So coastal wetlands, some examples would be salt marshes, mangroves. Really kind of important case there is their ability to cope with storm surge and make storm surge from like hurricanes much less impactful inland. Uh, Again, similar to we talked about wetlands being like a giant sponge for floodwaters, mangrove wetlands are well adapted to occasional hurricanes and storm surges and can help absorb a lot of the energy from hurricanes before they move inland. Um, there's coastal shorelines, shallow bays, inlet swamps, mudflats, all kinds of examples. We have some pretty cool estuaries uh, right here in Washington State on the coast. All right. Um, but what's again, like I said, is interesting about them is that there we have freshwater and saltwater, and so sometimes the plants and animals that live in the coastal wetlands or estuaries are completely under freshwater. Sometimes they're completely under saltwater, or might have a little mix of both in what they call brackish water. Okay, so the plants and animals that live there, like typically plants are well adapted for saltwater or well adapted to freshwater. Very few species are well adapted for both. And so the plants living there have to adapt to both conditions. All right. Um, really important food and habitat source, especially for migratory birds. And like I mentioned before, they do help to reduce damage from storm surges. All right. So, what sorts of human activities are threatening wetlands or have threatened wetlands in the past? A lot of times they're drained for agriculture. So the soil quality might be really high in those areas, so they'll drain them out and plant food there, or like rice fields and stuff like that. Sometimes they're drained to help reduce mosquito populations, right? Sometimes they'll dredge them out, and dredging, by the way, means kind of like scooping off sediments and mud off the bottom to make a deeper channel. Um, Obviously, constructing dams, dikes, or seawalls can impact the health of wetlands. They fill them in. Sometimes they use them actually for like solid waste landfills. Um, Build roads over them, mine for gravel, fossil fuels, etc. Okay. Um, so wetlands globally are shrinking by 58,500 acres per year on average. Okay, uh, so because wetlands have been discovered to be so important and so effective at providing some of these essential ecosystem services, there is legislation in place to help protect them in the U.S. at least. All right. Uh, so kind of the basic policy for wetlands in the U.S. is there's supposed to be a no net loss policy. And basically what that means uh, is if you need to develop in an area where there is a wetland, that can be allowed, but it has to be accompanied by the restoration or building of an equal size wetland somewhere else. Okay, so it's not necessarily that as though the wetlands are completely protected from a development. It's just that there's a no net loss policy. So it's kind of like a trade. Well, I'm going to build here, but I'll build an equal size wetland somewhere else or something like that. Okay. Now, the other piece to the puzzle there is, if they develop a wetland, they can work to restore wetlands. And sometimes a company or an agency is given a permit to build in an area where there's a wetland with the promise of restoring or building a new wetland. Trouble is, building or restoring wetlands aren't always successful, so might not really meet that no net loss idea. All right, that is it for today. It's a short one.